Anyone that's spent a considerable amount of time as a gas mask collector is going to be painfully aware of the scarcity of post-war Japanese masks. And today I have something for you that's absolutely no exception. I'm actually kind of astonished and flabbergasted that I have this thing to begin with. But what we're going to be talking about today is the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Type 3 protective mask, or at least just the face piece of one. Before I get into how I even got this thing in a minute here, let's talk briefly a bit about the history of Japanese post-war military masks. So, as you might recall, at least for those of you following this channel or familiar with the topic, the first mask that Japan adopted militarily following the end of the Second World War was more or less a copy of the US M3-10116 lightweight service mask. This was designated the Type 1 and was, I believe, initially produced by the Sanko Chemical Company and later produced by Shigematsu as well. This continued well into the 1960s when Japan would ultimately adopt the Type 2, again also produced by Sanko and Shigematsu, which in this case was a copy of the M9A1 series field protective masks. The last mask to be produced by both Sanko and Shigematsu, although I've only ever seen examples by Shigematsu, so it might have just been them, was the Type 3, which was adopted sometime in the early 1970s, which, as you might be able to figure, was a clone of the American M17 field protective mask. Now, there was a third outrigger in the Japanese gas mask development market, and that was Koken Limited. They'd been relatively dormant up until this point, mostly kind of just pumping out mediocre industrial masks, but by the 1980s, they decided to take a whack at it and produced Japan's first indigenous military mask design. I believe it was adopted sometime in the mid-80s, according to my research, and this would be designated the Type 4. This was issued extensively throughout the Japanese military, replacing the older stocks of Type 3 and Type 2 masks throughout the late 1980s, and by the 1990s, it was pretty much their unanimously standard, service mask throughout the JSDF. By the year 2000, the Type 4B, or as it would later be known as the Type 00, would be adopted, and both masks continued to see service well throughout the 2010s, up until 2018, when the Type 18 mask, which is kind of loosely inspired by the M50, is actually starting to see issue with the JSDF, and I'm going to assume both masks are going to be replaced relatively soon at this point. So that aside, let's take a deeper look at the Type 4, and I guess we should basically start with how I even got this thing. So the JSDF is incredibly protective of their military CBRN equipment. They don't release this stuff to the public whatsoever, and I've even heard it rumored that it's even illegal for Japanese civilians to own this stuff. So I am genuinely baffled about how this thing wound up on US eBay, but the whole gist of how I got it is that me and Moulage were actually we were sitting down with his folks watching Svengoolie. We were actually watching Godzilla Destroy All Monsters, of all things. Just kind of ironic given the scenario. But yeah, he was literally just browsing eBay Mobile and he found this thing at pure random and just snagged it instantly. So it was just like, I'm still just kind of taken aback by the fact that we own one of these things now. Like, this is, I just made an entire video with him, bashing the concept of collecting masks for rarity, but this is like, as far as I'm aware, is the only example of this in the United States at this current point, at the time of making this video. I have not seen any other collector own one of these. This might be the only example outside of Japan, at least publicly known. So if you have one of these, please just make it known. I want to see more people with these. They're interesting masks, and they actually do have a little bit of an interesting history, but I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit here. I didn't actually cover the full history of the Type 4 specifically. But let's talk about the features, because you've been just staring at it stagnant on the screen for quite a while here. So allow me to demystify the whole design here. So obviously the whole appearance of the sad-eye lenses is very palpable with this design, very common with Japanese gas mask designs throughout the post-war period. There are a lot of interesting assets of the Type 4, and honestly, it's a very high-quality mask. Like, in the period it was developed, it would have been, a pretty solid contender as far as, adopting a westernized gas mask design. Like, it's like in terms of build quality, I would probably put it up there with like the Canadian C4, but it also has a lot of German design assets to it. Like the harness buckles, for instance, these are very reminiscent of like, Draeger industrial harness buckles, and this central inlet outlet assembly is also very, very reminiscent of Draeger designs. Just a lot of various design assets that are, it's clear that they tried to cobble as much stuff together from outside influence while still kind of keeping it original to, Japanese gas mask design. But anyways, let's talk a bit about the individual hardware and features. So obviously the first thing you notice is the lenses. These are interestingly made of glass and not polycarbonate, as was the upcoming practice at the time this was developed. So I would say, though, that glass is not a bad choice for this particular mask, considering that it did not have an outsert ecosystem to choose from. So there was really nothing protecting these lenses from being scratched. So glass is a very good choice in that regard, since it's a lot harder to scratch than, most polymers are. And it's also, it's not going to get hazed or fogged up or damaged by certain decon solutions. So it's a relatively safe option as far as, choosing a material to make gas mask lenses out of, but still kind of interesting to see this late in the game. But the shape of them is obviously interesting. They have that sad eye appearance that Japanese masks are kind of known for. They are held together with a two-piece brass clamp, which is held together with a single nut and bolt on each frame, and then they also split apart at the other end of it there with a little sheet metal hook or like bent metal hook integrated into the clamp design, and they're painted the same sort of dark olive drab color as the rest of the mask. It might look pretty black on camera, but this is actually sort of a very dark grayish green olive drab color. So those are the lenses. This might be hard to capture on camera, but there is actually a mount interface for optical inserts. You probably could see that pretty well, but there's a series of holes along the inner edge of the facepiece near the lens, and then on the opposite side, I don't know if you can see that, but right there in this corner, there's a little notch, and I assume that's for the optical insert to sort of impinge upon, and you could just sort of rock it on this point and adjust the height of it based on this series of holes. So kind of interesting how they went about that. This central inlet outlet assembly also has a few notable things. It's held in place with a pretty typical ear clamp. A lot of gas mask designs have this, especially industrial ones. Again, very reminiscent of Draeger masks. The voice emitter is very, very similar to those found on a lot of MSA industrial masks, such as the UltraView, the Ultra Elite, etc. You have a central 40 millimeter threaded port here with a just an inlet valve on a gasket that can be entirely removed from the facepiece to make this thing presumably SCBA compatible. I believe I've seen photos of these things adapted for SCBA use. Below that is obviously the outlet valve, and this entire assembly has a removable plastic cover held in place by two hex bolts that you can remove and access the outlet valve and any other internal components. Not that there really is any, but you can just remove that. On the side here, you can see the drinking device, and this is an entirely proprietary system. This is not like an M1 quick disconnect or an Avon connector. So what the Japanese ended up doing is you have like this rubber cover, which is kind of similar to a lot of Swiss, like Swiss and Czech drinking systems. But this connector here is very interesting. It's basically like a little mini quick disconnect. If you've ever seen like an air compressor, it's a lot like that, where there's like little ball bearings around the circumference of this fitting, and you would press the connector into that and it would sort of snap into place. And I presumably you would kind of push on this, or you would do something to get it to disconnect, but it basically would lock into place with those bearings. I don't know if you can see them very well, but just kind of give you a better look at this whole interface here. And this is a ridiculously tiny port. Like if I saw this and I didn't know what it was and had no prior knowledge that it was a drinking system, I would have assumed that this was like a microphone connector, because this is the water flow on this has got to be like some of the most ludicrously pathetic. But it's a drinking system at least, and it is a fairly robust one as far as connectors. I mean, you can't really get more robust than having a locking ball bearing system. The downside to this drinking system, though, is that it uses an external tube that kind of links between the canteen and the mask itself. It's not a tube that's retained on the assembly. I mean, this whole assembly is bigger than, like, say, a Swiss SM90s, so they could have easily designed the geometry to wrap a tube around it. So not sure why they did it like this, but you know, it is what it is. And they sort of kept the same sort of interface on the Type 4B as well. I think even the Type 18 has it, so clearly they're happy with this design because they keep going back to it. So that's interesting to note. Again, the harness buckles, very similar to the Draeger ones, where they have a plastic stud that mounts through a hole on the facepiece, and then you have this sort of keyhole shape that the buckle is kind of snaps onto here, and the buckle swivels on it, and it can just rotate in any which direction. Fairly simple, not really much to say about it. It's a fairly non-intuitive system. However, the real interesting thing to talk about is the top straps here. So this is obviously a 6-point head harness, but the topmost straps are sort of converged into one, so it really kind of acts as a wider 5-point. And it's very comfortable, honestly, but this is obviously sized for Japanese faces, so it's a bit too small on me. And even interestingly, there doesn't even seem to be a sizing system, so I'm assuming this is sort of a universally sized mask, but there is actually one way to sort of adjust the individual sizing here. You can see on the other side of this big rubber slab that the two forehead straps mount on, there's two different positions you can put the mounting studs for these buckle tabs here. So you can actually, if I wanted to, I could remove this and, you know, extend this out a little bit so the, you know, harness fit my head just a little bit better, but I don't think it'll make that much of a difference, and I really don't feel like screwing with this thing too much, so I'm just going to leave it be. That's really all there is to see externally. There really isn't any outer markings or serial codes or stamps on the outside that I can see, at least. So just kind of give you a little once over of all the little nooks and crannies before I invert the harness and talk about the inside. The head harness itself is a mesh skull cap design, which is made of two layers of mesh, and kind of all the straps are kind of sandwiched inside of it, which is kind of an interesting way to go about it, but you know, whatever works. The elastic is in pretty decent shape, as is the rest of the mask. It's a little bit wrinkled on the bottom straps, but overall this mask is in incredibly good shape despite, you know, missing literally all of its accessories. So let's get the harness out of the way and talk about the interior, because there's some interesting things going on in here as well. So as you can see, it has a very beefy, comfortable reflex seal, or interned peripheral seal as it's often known. You have a inner oronasal cup, which is very short and squat, very clearly designed for Asian facial ergonomics. You have the inner drinking straw protruding on the interior, just in front of the voice diaphragm. And I do not think that this drinking tube moves. I think it's just in this weird U-bend shape so that it provides a little extra slack when you grab it with your lips or teeth and kind of pull it towards you. So it has a little room to stretch with this particular geometry. On the very bottom, below the chin cup, I don't know if the camera will focus on that or if it's too dark, but you can see the outlet valve down there. And then the nose cup has a singular valve disc. Again, the lighting is a little bit bad in here, so I don't know if you can see that properly. I'll probably end up remaking an entire video on this with proper editing at some point in the future, but there is a single nose cup valve disc at the very top there. Let me get it to focus. And then pulling that down, you can see the valve seat, which is a little bit stretched out of proportion because it's molded into the rubber here, but you know, you get the gist of it. And there really isn't anything to see underneath the peripheral seal. There's no markings underneath there. Only thing to note is the interior of the forehead. Underneath the forehead here, I'm trying not to bump into the hand here that's holding my camera. You can see a manufacturer's stamp made by Koken Limited, and you can see a date stamp of 96. At least I believe that's a date stamp. And then a marking above that, which I believe is some sort of JSDF marking. I could be very, very wrong on that, so if you know better than me, feel free to correct me by all means. But that's really about it. The other, probably the most famous use of these masks within the JSDF was these were quite prominently seen in the aftermath of the 1996 Tokyo sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subways carried out by the Aum Shinrikyo death cult. Like that whole incident, the Type 4 was very, very prevalent in the media, and it was basically every single member of the JSDF decon crews were seen using this mask. And even the police, the Japanese police had a variant of this mask that was made entirely of black rubber and components, and it did not have a drinking system. So that's like the only other thing to note about this particular design, is that there was a police variant, like I said, made out of black rubber. And actually, when Moulage and I first found the listing for this mask, like we were kind of like assuming like, oh, this is going to be a police one, because I have seen police ones sold on Japanese eBay, Yahoo auction. So we were kind of like, it was kind of a gamble over whether or not this would be like an actual JSDF Type 4 or one of the police versions. And then we realized like, oh, it has the drinking system. The JSDF ones only had drinking systems. So yeah, so I can't think of really anything else to say about it. It's not anything particularly special once you actually handle it, but it's a very interesting mask, all things considered. There's not a lot to it, but there's enough with the design that's quirky enough to mention, and it's just an interesting mask. I'm really hopeful that eventually I can get the rest of the accessories for it, since, it's missing the filter, the carrier, basically everything but the mask, as I've said. So if you have any more information that I didn't cover in this video, please feel free to drop it in the comments. There really isn't a whole lot out there on these masks. The JSDF, like I said, is very secretive with these masks, and they don't release a lot to the public. So what you end up seeing is basically what you can see in photographs, effectively. So that's really all I have to say here. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them down in the comments below, and I will see you all next time.